What our topic is going to be. It's going to be on the resurrection of Christ. So I feel like for the last 2 weeks I've been talking almost about nothing except the resurrection of Christ in various meetings and groups and different places. But generally when I've been talking about the spiritual aspect of it and what does it mean in our lives and how do you live the resurrection and those kinds of questions. Today's going to be different because this is Aletheia. So what we're going to do is today we're going to put on our Sherlock Holmes hat, which is a very cool hat. I wish I had one, but I don't. I don't smoke a pipe, so I probably, would look silly with the hat without the pipe. But what we're going to try and do is a bit of detective work. We're going to be looking at if the resurrection is so important to us as Christians, if it goes to the heart of our faith and how we live our lives, how do we know that it really happened? Did it or didn't it? And this, of course, is the question that the skeptic would pose, right? How do you know that Jesus really rose from the dead? It's 2,000 years ago. People don't rise from the dead. It would be very odd if someone rose from the dead. In fact, the skeptic would say, not just odd, pretty much impossible. So there's something wrong with you guys. You're believing in something that you shouldn't. So today we're going to see how we deal with those kinds of skeptical challenges. Why is it that we believe in the resurrection and that it really happened as a historical event? And I want to point out from the beginning that this is a historical question, right? There are lots of ways to answer questions about things. But the right way, I think, or the most right way, the most suitable way or appropriate way to deal with the question of the resurrection of Christ is using the techniques of history. Why am I saying that? Well, let's consider an alternative. Is this a scientific question? Now, there is a scientific question, right? We know a lot about human physiology and how the body works. Okay, scientifically, can someone who's been dead for 3 days rise from the dead? Now, there is a pretty easy answer to that one. No, right? Medically speaking, no. Bodies break down, cells break down, and no matter, well, certainly we know of no science that could bring back a dead body that's been dead for 3 days, bring it back to life, right? We don't know how to do that. Maybe there is a way somewhere out in outer space among the aliens. Maybe they've discovered all kinds of advanced medicine, but that's not going to help us here, right? We're human beings on the earth and it was 2,000 years ago. So is that then the right way to decide whether the resurrection really happened or not? So many people would, skeptics would say, yes, that is how you decide it, right? We don't know of any way you can bring back a dead body after 3 days, therefore it could not have happened. I'll come back to that at the end of today's talk, but I will be arguing that that's actually the wrong way to go about it. Because what Christians believe is not that a doctor went to the dead body of Christ, did some medical procedure or administered some medical therapy and brought him back to life. That's not what Christians are arguing. We are up front, right from the beginning, this is a miracle. It's not natural. It's not something you would see in a hospital. It is a miracle. So then the question becomes, well, can miracles happen? And that's what we'll come back to right at the very end. But what I'm suggesting you at the beginning is the right way to answer the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead? You would go about answering that question in the same way as you would answer the question, was Julius Caesar killed by a group of Roman senators, including a guy called Brutus? Okay, are you going to get out your microscope to answer that question? You're not. You're going to use the methods of historical investigation. So that's what we're going to be doing today. All the stuff I'll be telling you is basically the stuff historians do. And we're simply going to apply the historical investigation method to the event of the resurrection of Christ 2,000 years ago. Okay, and one thing that historians love, maybe above all else, is evidence, right? You need evidence. And since we're talking about Sherlock Holmes, it gives me a chance to quote one of my favourite Sherlock quotes. Data, data, data. I can't make bricks without clay, right? And that's why he would go around, the typical picture of Holmes with his magnifying glass. What's he doing with his magnifying glass? He's looking for evidence. And the trick is to find the right evidence and then to take that evidence and try and see what hypothesis best fits the evidence. That's our plan for today. So what evidence do we have? I think that there are three crucial pieces of evidence. You may disagree as to whether Jesus rose from the dead or not, but as we'll see, I hope, by the method of historical investigation, you cannot disagree that these three pieces of evidence are true. You can argue about what to make of them, but you can't argue that they are. And the first one is that the early Christians really believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, and I'll go through why, right? They wrote about it, they lived it, they sometimes died for it, but they believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, once again, you may think they were mistaken in their belief, but I don't think you can seriously, historically question that they believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And we'll go through the evidence soon. The second one is that the tomb was empty. There was no dead body. Now, once again, you can think of different reasons why the tomb was empty, but all the historical sources that we have that mention the tomb mention an empty tomb. And we'll speak about that in more detail shortly. And thirdly, that people believed they saw the risen Christ. Right? It's not just that they believed he rose from the dead, they believed they actually saw him and met him and spoke to him after they had seen him die and entombed, and then after that they actually saw him alive again and they spoke to him. So these are our three pieces of evidence. Let's go through them in slightly more detail. So we know that early Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead because they wrote about it, okay? And they didn't just write about it in one place or it's not just one witness, but many people wrote about it. Not only that, another thing historians love is, I forget the term, primary evidence, primary source. I think if the historians can help me out here, is that the right word? Primary sources, right? It's people who actually saw the event and wrote down what they saw. A secondary source would be someone who heard someone else talking about the event and then they wrote down what they heard about it. And we have secondary sources about the resurrection, of course. We also have, interestingly, primary sources, right? People who actually say, I saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. And we know that they believed this, genuinely believed it, because they actually went out and told other people about it. Okay, that's generally, if you really believe in something, you'll go out and tell people about it. But not only that, many of them ended up dying for that belief, that Jesus showed that he is the Son of God, and one of the most important ways he showed that he's the Son of God is that he has power over death. And they were so convinced of that, that when people challenged what they believed and said to them, we will kill you if you don't retract what you're saying, they said, go ahead and kill me. Okay, we'll go into more detail later on. Second, the empty tomb. Now, once again, another thing that historians really, really like, something that makes a strong case for a historical event having happened, is if you have more than one source telling you about that event. Nowadays, we tend to think that, but really, come on, Abuna, the primary source, there's only one. It's the Bible, right? Wrong. The Bible is not one source. The Bible that we have today, which is one book, makes us think that way. But for the first 300-400 years, the Bible was not one book. It was a whole lot of different books, and they were scattered all over the world. They were written by different authors, and it's only after some time that people thought to actually gather those different books into a single volume to make it easy to access and to read. The first known case of that happening that we know is in the time of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, where he started to put the books of the Bible into this incredible new technology called the Codex. Codex is just a fancy word for book, right? Because before that, they were scrolls. Like, they didn't have books with pages that you turn over. They had scrolls. You'd unroll the scroll and you'd read. So the book of the Gospel of Mark was a scroll. It was a scroll, and that was kept by itself. The letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians was another scroll written by a different author and kept separately. And if you ask people, how many scrolls do you have, they'd say, I have 2, right? They wouldn't say, I have 1. They think of them as 2 different sources. So we actually have multiple sources of accounts of the resurrection of Christ. But maybe they got it wrong. Okay, maybe they were lying, for example. We'll go through these in more detail later. But one of the reasons we believe that the tomb was empty is the accounts of the empty tomb tell us embarrassing things. And generally, historians, particularly historians of ancient documents, they know that in ancient times, if you want to convince someone of a story, you don't put in things that are likely to make them doubt that story. So what is an example? Women were the first witnesses at the empty tomb. I apologise to all the female members of the audience for what I'm about to say, but this is how people thought back then, right? You don't trust the witness of a woman, because if Aristotle is to be believed, women are kind of on the border between human and non-human, right? They're inferior. Their brains don't work properly. So you can't trust a woman's evidence. And we still have echoes of that. You find echoes of that in ancient Jewish tradition. You find it up until today in other Middle Eastern traditions, Islamic tradition, where I believe the rule still is that the witness of one man is equal to the witness of 2 women, right? Because you can't trust the women. That's a very old, venerable way of thinking. And that was certainly what was in play at the time when the apostles wrote the account and said the tomb was empty. So if you want to convince people that the tomb was empty, the last thing you'd want to say is, and the person who discovered the empty tomb and told everybody else was a woman, right? Because you're asking for trouble. You're asking for people to not believe you. So why would you say that 2,000 years ago? The most sensible answer is because it was true. This was a detail that actually happened. And although it was embarrassing for the apostles to write that, although in their culture it was kind of hindering their mission of convincing people, because it was true, they wrote it down. And there are lots of other sort of examples of this criterion of embarrassment. Also, it's interesting that in all of the different accounts, in all of the decades and centuries that followed the life of Christ, not one of the ancient sources puts forward the theory that the tomb was not empty. Even the opponents of Christianity accept the fact that the tomb was empty. And they then go on and describe reasons why it was empty that are different to what the Christians say. But they accept the fact of the empty tomb. And that's why I'm saying that these are pieces of evidence that no sensible historian would really disagree with, right? Because using the techniques, the principles of historical investigation, this is a very clear thing. The tomb was empty. And the third one was the appearances of the risen Christ. He not just once, right? He didn't just appear once and then that was it, nobody else saw him again, but he appeared many times. I think St. Paul actually lists 6 different times, like in one little passage, he lists 6 different times that Jesus appeared to various people, various numbers of people, and so on. Not only that, he actually appeared to many people at the same time. So in that passage, St. Paul writes, "He was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep." Now, we don't know exactly when the first letter to the Corinthians was written, but probably within, like at the latest, in the 60s, probably earlier, in the 50s AD. So we're talking about maybe 2-3 decades after the events, as a maximum. And so St. Paul is saying, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, that Jesus rose from the dead and we saw him, there are 500 people. He appeared to 500 people at once, and many of them are still around. Ask me, I'll tell you where they are. You can go and ask them. You can go and investigate for yourself and find out if I'm lying or not. This is not the kind of thing that a person says if they're making up a lie, right? You don't say that. You don't invite people to check out your false evidence. And not only that, the accounts of the resurrection give really basic, simple details of things like Jesus ate fish, right? That's what you do when you're telling a story of an experience that, I was there. Oh, and I remember we ate fish that day, right? That's kind of what they're doing. What he said to Thomas and so on. Most of the appearances were to his disciples, but one of them, at least, that we know of, because apparently there were more, the hints are given in the Bible that there were other appearances that were never recorded in those writings, but one of them was to an enemy, who eventually, it is true, became one of his followers, Saul of Tarsus, who became St. Paul. Okay, and I'll leave that there. And just to show you the idea of the multiple witnesses, so we won't go through this, but just to show you've got there, first column is 1 Corinthians 15, second column written by St. Paul, Acts 13 written by St. Luke, and the Gospel of Mark written by St. Mark. So you have 3 different witnesses, 3 different people recording things that they saw or things that they heard. In Mark's case, probably what he saw himself. In Luke and St. Paul's case, probably what they heard as a secondary source. But you find that they agree, right? They tell the same story. So historically speaking, this is gold, right? I have more than one witness corroborating the same facts. This is historical gold. Okay, and I've just got a couple of quotes here just to quickly deal with the kind of sub-question or back question to this, which is there are still some people who question whether Jesus even existed in the first place or not. So if he'd never existed, then there's no point talking about him rising from the dead, right? But I won't tell you, I'll let a couple of experts tell you. So Daniel B. Wallace says, "We have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great." So Bart Ehrman says, "We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period." See, I'm trying to be a good historian and give you 2 sources, you see, not just one, in case you think I fiddled the books. Right? There are at least 2 sources, but there are actually many, many more sources. This is not a hard thing to find if you start searching. Again, people believe that Jesus was just a normal person or he was a prophet or whatever, but one thing it is very hard to do if you care about getting your history right is to believe that Jesus just never existed, that he was made up. That's a really difficult thing to sustain. Okay, so N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, says, "The empty tomb and appearances have a historical probability so high as to be virtually certain, like the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So just to emphasize that those 3 criteria, 2 of them are mentioned in this quote. I couldn't find one with all 3, unfortunately. But those three pieces of evidence, 3 pieces of data, are very, very well historically attested by any standard of historical evidence. But what are we going to make of them? This is the really interesting question. Even if those 3 things are true, even if the early Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And even if they believed that they saw him after he rose from the dead, and even if the tomb was empty, are there different theories that we can come up with to explain those three pieces of evidence? So the rest of tonight is just going to be me working through, I think there's 7 theories altogether. And we're going to, at the end of the analysis of each theory, I'm going to very concretely give them either a cross or a tick, right? Just to make it like really, I don't know, it's fun crossing and ticking things off. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. So here are our theories. And remember that what we're saying is, which of these theories best accounts for those 3 pieces of pretty solid evidence? The options are the Swoon Theory, the wrong tomb theory, the twin theory, deception theories, mythology theories, hallucination and delusion theories, and finally, that the resurrection actually happened. Without further ado, let's go to the first one. And you probably notice that I've kind of arranged them in a particular order, which is from, personally, what I think is least likely to most likely. And you won't be surprised to see that I think real resurrection is at the end. But I hope by the time we get to the end, I'll have shown you why I think that's the case. Okay, what's the Swoon Theory? Jesus never died on the cross. He only fainted. He only swooned. But he awoke on the 3rd day from his swoon, and this was mistakenly believed to be a resurrection by the apostles, right? So Jesus had a tough time. He was beaten. He was whipped. He was dehydrated, right? Hanging on the cross for a few hours, he fainted. And they thought he was dead. So they took him down from the cross, they put him in a nice cool tomb, and in the coolness of the tomb, he gradually recovered, and after 3 days he woke up and came out of the tomb somehow. One of the problems with this theory is, how does he come out of a sealed stone tomb? That's a little bit difficult. Of course, in medieval cemeteries, I don't know if you know this, I hope I don't give you nightmares. I apologise if I do. But apparently when they kind of excavate them for archaeology and stuff, sometimes they find coffins with scratch marks on the inside of the lid. Right? So this is kind of the thing that they're thinking about, that someone was thought to be dead and they bury them, and of course if you're buried in a coffin, you're going to be there saying, "Get me out," and shouting and scratching and everything, but there's nothing you can do to get out. That kind of would apply here, right? We know from the accounts in the Gospels that they rolled a big heavy stone over the door of the tomb and they sealed it, right? How does a man who's just recovered from a faint get out? Well, that's an interesting question. But there are lots of other problems with this theory. One is that the soldiers who crucified Christ were experienced soldiers. There was a centurion among them who knew what he was doing. And the consequences for getting something like a crucifixion wrong, we know from other historical sources, were pretty bad. So they got these things right. It was very unusual for them to make a mistake. So it would be quite a stretch to think that the centurions mistook a fainting man for a dead man, right? And they actually, they tested, right? They put the spear in his side. But we'll come back to that in a second, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, the physiology of crucifixion and death also helps us to understand why this is really a difficult option to accept. When they put the spear in his side, right, and they make a point of that blood and water came out, right? So what is that? What is blood and water? And the most likely thing, people like in modern times who've tried to analyse it, they basically think what's probably happened is you had something called an effusion, which is the build-up of a watery fluid, probably around the lungs, possibly around the heart. Okay? And what happens when a living patient gets one of those kinds of effusions and it gets like quite bad, and we know that that's what would happen on a cross, by the way, because you're hanging up like this, and what's happening is, because of your arms being pulled up, that changes the dynamics of the blood flow and the fluid flow in your chest. And so it's likely that you would get a build-up. Apparently the way you die in a crucifixion is you drown to death, right? You drown in the build-up of your own fluids filling your lungs and squishing your heart so that the heart can't beat properly, and eventually you can neither breathe and your heart eventually can't beat anymore, and that's how you die. Now, we know all of this today because we have modern medicine and we understand that. We know, the doctors among you will know, there's this lovely procedure when you have someone with a, what is it, a tamponade, isn't it? A cardiac tamponade. And you have this lovely procedure where you get a nice big needle and you just stick it into their chest and all the fluid comes out, often bloody fluid, right, because you've pushed it through blood vessels or whatever, and then that relieves the pressure, right? They thought he was dead. They poked him with the spear. Lots of blood and water came out, right? And he didn't flinch, he didn't do anything. It's very likely that he actually had died because of that filling up of the chest with the fluids. And a cardiac arrest, we also know today that if you die, if your heart stops beating for more than a few minutes, you can't come back from that. And I think, you know, I'm not sure, again, maybe people can correct me, but I think the longest a person has ever actually been like clinically dead and then recovered is something around half an hour or so. I don't know if there's anything longer than that. Okay, that's sort of the most that I've heard of. We're talking about Jesus dying and hanging there for over an hour on the cross, right? After they pierced him, he hung there on the cross, you know, dead, basically. And they came to check and so on, and then by the time they checked and went back and got permission to get them down and all that sort of stuff, he was dead for quite a while, hanging on the cross. Limp, hanging, right? Even if he had a little brief recovery, just hanging there longer would have made sure that he was dead, right? There's no doubt about that, medically speaking, I mean. And the resurrected Jesus wasn't brain damaged, right? Sometimes people are, you know, clinically dead for a while, and because there's not enough blood getting into their brains for a while, then damage happens to the brain. But the Jesus who's described after the resurrection is certainly not brain damaged. He's lucid, he's teaching, he's remembering, he's doing all the things that brains do that he was doing before he died. And also, swoon cases, like fainting cases and things like that, they tend to happen in things like, you know, where people had an infection and therefore they fainted from the fever and the toxins in their blood and so on. And then they're the ones you find in the medieval coffins, right? But having been so beaten up and maltreated, having suffered trauma of the kind that Jesus would have suffered in the crucifixion, is not the kind of situation where you'd expect someone to just faint for a little while and then wake up once again. It's not impossible, but it's an unlikely scenario. So we're going to give this one a cross, okay? A lovely, satisfying red cross, and not the nice kind of red cross, the bad kind of red cross. Let's move on to the wrong tomb theory. So this one says that Jesus died on the cross and was buried, but his followers got confused. They went to the wrong tomb after his death and they found it empty, so they wrongly assumed that he had risen from the dead. Okay, is this plausible? Again, you can see why I put this early on, right? It's highly unlikely. Number one, like, how many people have to be confused about this? A lot of people were involved. And they all got it wrong? Okay, that seems unlikely. Some of the people who would have had to get it wrong would be Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb it was. Right? This is his tomb. He owned the tomb. He prepared the tomb. He inspected the tomb. He got it ready. He probably walked down one day and said, oh, this is where my body's going to lie one day. And now suddenly we're expected to believe that he forgot where the tomb is. He couldn't go and ask the person he bought the land from, hey, where's that land that I bought from you? You know, if you went to the tomb of Christ and found it empty and thought to yourself, am I in the wrong tomb? Which is reasonable. Wouldn't you work it out? Wouldn't you go and ask people? Wouldn't you go and look at other tombs? Wouldn't you ask your relatives, hey, is that where I had my tomb? So this seems a very, very implausible one, very much clutching at straws. And we should also point out that it does not account for the post-resurrection appearances of Christ. Remember we said that there were 3 bits of evidence. One of them is that the disciples believed that they saw Jesus. If they went to the wrong tomb and that was all that happened, they would not say, and we saw Jesus, right? The wrong tomb does not explain the fact that they saw Jesus. So guess what we're going to give this one? You guessed it. Another satisfying red cross. The twin theory. So on this theory, Jesus had an identical twin brother that nobody mentioned, that was never spoken about anywhere. And when Jesus died, he stayed in the tomb, but then the disciples met his twin brother and they thought, Jesus is alive, because they look the same. Okay, what's wrong with this theory? Well, one big problem is if you're a historian, you want evidence. And there is 0 evidence that Jesus had a twin brother. So this is what you'd call an ad hoc argument. It's like, where you just make something up because it kind of explains what you want to be explained, but you actually have no reason for the thing you made up, right? So if you wake up in the morning and your phone has moved, like you remember putting it on your bedside thing, bedside, what do they call them? Dresser, counter, whatever, right? And you wake up and you find that it's on the coffee table in the living room. Here's an ad hoc explanation. The Apple fairy came and moved my phone, all right? That explains. It does do a good job of explaining why the phone was not where you thought you'd left it. The problem with it is there is no evidence for the Apple fairy. So it's an ad hoc explanation. A better explanation would be something that you have evidence for. Things like, I know that I have been absent-minded in the past and that I've left things and forgotten where I'd left them. Maybe I just forgot to bring my phone in, and that's why it's on the coffee table outside. Now, there's evidence for that because I've been through that absent-mindedness before. So the twin theory is an ad hoc argument which has no evidence to support it. It's also highly unlikely that when the disciples said, look, it's Jesus, she would say, actually, I think you're right. Right? The mother of the twins can't tell the difference between her twin boys. That seems a very odd thing. And if St. Mary told them, actually, guys, you're all wrong, this is not Jesus, this is his twin brother, non-existent, then they would have said, oh, actually, you're his mother, so we'll believe you. And it's also very unlikely that the twin himself would not have explained the error, right? If you get mistaken for, I don't know, I'm trying to find someone who looks like a famous person, but I can't. Okay, imagine you're walking in the street and someone mistakes you for, I don't know, who's that guy that all the teenagers love? Eddie someone, the singer? Ed Sheeran, that's the one, yes, okay. Imagine you're walking along the road and someone comes up to you and says, hey, you're Ed Sheeran, aren't you? Can I have your autograph? What would you say, right? You wouldn't say, yeah, sure. Sure, I write it out to you. Okay, you'd say, no, I'm sorry, I think you've got the wrong guy. Oh, come on, sing a song for me. No, you really don't want me to do that, trust me. Okay, so the twin himself surely, especially if he saw things gathering and growing as the church did, would say, guys, no, it's not me. So again, and again, it doesn't account for the empty tomb, right? Even if there was a twin brother, if you saw a person you thought was Jesus, but it was really his twin brother, surely the first thing you would do is go back to the tomb and check, is the body still there? Because if the body's still there, then that can't be Jesus, okay? But it doesn't account for the empty tomb. So we're going to give this a big red cross too. Deception theories. Okay, now we're getting to some more serious kind of explanations for these things. So I've got 2 variations on deception theories here. A, someone unknown stole the body of Christ from the tomb, and the apostles made sense of this by misunderstanding the teaching of Christ to have prophesied his resurrection. So the good thing about this explanation, right? Someone stole the body, they went to look for the body, they didn't find the body, and so the way they explained it was Jesus rose from the dead. But they were mistaken, because that's not what really happened. This accounts for the empty tomb, right? This is a good explanation for the empty tomb. And we know people steal dead bodies for various reasons. I don't know if it was a big thing in first century Palestine, but I believe in up until recently in places like India and Bangladesh, they did steal dead bodies because you could make a lot of money selling like skeletons to medical students and things like that. I believe they put a stop to that now. Anyway, let's assume that people stole things out of dead bodies. But what are the problems with it? Okay, number one, it does not account for the appearances of the risen Christ. Okay, the tomb is empty, the body is gone, we think Jesus rose from the dead. But that still doesn't explain why we think that we met him and ate fish with him and spoke with him and touched his wounds. Right? If it's just somebody stole the body, that doesn't explain it. It doesn't explain, therefore, also the conviction and the belief of his followers to such an extent that they would be willing to die for that belief. Right? If it's something that you still have some doubts about, you didn't get enough evidence for, would you die for it? Or when you're pressed, would you say something more like, okay, don't kill me, I'm actually not sure about this, let me think about it a little bit more and I'll get back to you, or something like that, right? So it doesn't account for people willingly dying for a resurrected Lord, someone who proved his claims by rising from the dead, and I believe that because I saw it myself. And it doesn't account for the strong effect that it had on the lives of Christians, of whom we have records of many of them, including James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, and so on. So James, we have like hints that he didn't really believe what Jesus was saying beforehand, and they were criticizing him when Jesus was still preaching and walking around. And then after the resurrection, he gets right on board. Okay, so what changed? Well, we know that he saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. That would explain why he changed his mind, why he changed his attitude, to such an extent that a few years later, when they come to have that council in Jerusalem in Acts 15, who do they choose to be the chairman, the president of that meeting? They choose James, the brother of Jesus. That's how invested he is in this belief of this new community that Jesus rose from the dead. What changed? So we're going to give deception theory's version A across, right? That someone else stole the body and people were confused. Okay, that doesn't seem to stack up. But there is another version of a deception theory. What if this was all done on purpose? What if the disciples were nefarious con men? What if they deceived everyone? So they went and stole the body out of the tomb, and then they went and told lies about it to everyone and said, Jesus rose from the dead. Okay? This again accounts for the empty tomb, right? If that's what they did, then the tomb would be empty. It's very good. But it doesn't account for that conviction and belief of the apostles even unto death. Con men are very, very rarely willing to die for their false belief. And we have lots of evidence for that throughout history, right? When people make stuff up, they're not willing to suffer a lot for their lie because they know that it's a lie. I've got a couple of examples there. I hope, if there are any Scientologists or any Mormons here, I don't mean to offend you or anything, but these are just matters of historical record, right? So we know that L. Ron Hubbard, when things started to get a bit dodgy and dangerous for him, mainly because of tax evasion and things like that, right? So what did he do? Did he stand up and say, no, you must all respect what I'm saying and listen to what I'm saying and I don't care about the consequences? No, he got paranoid and he bought a big boat and he went and lived on it for like 10 years. And then after that, he went and hid in the desert on a farm or something so that nobody could find him, mostly the IRS. But, he clearly didn't have the courage of his convictions to stand up and say, what I'm doing is right and what I'm teaching is right. And of course, Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of Mormonism, famously died because of all the people who were so angry with him storming the jail where he was being held for having destroyed the offices of a newspaper that had written nasty things about him. So he went and destroyed the office, burned it down. So he got caught and put in jail, and the townspeople took things into their own hands and they stormed the jail and they killed him. What did he do? He fought back. He killed a few people on his way out, right? Is this a person who's willing to die for his beliefs? No, this is a person who got caught in telling a lie, which he probably himself, well, I shouldn't say that because we don't know, but it's possible that he himself didn't really believe it deep down, and when push comes to shove, right, then they try and find a way out of the bad situation, rather than standing up for the faith that they're teaching. And that's not what the early Christians did. Some of them even went joyfully to their martyrdom. And just think about that. People went joyfully with the people who they know are going to torture and kill them, believing that they are doing a good thing. Who does that? Someone who genuinely believes in the thing that they are dying for. They're not willing to suffer a lot for their lie because they know that it's a lie. I've got a couple of examples there. I don't mean, I hope, if there are any Scientologists or any Mormons here, I don't mean to offend you or anything, but these are just matters of historical record, right? So we know that L. Ron Hubbard, when things started to get a bit dodgy and dangerous for him, mainly because of tax evasion and things like that, right? So what did he do? Did he stand up and say, no, you must all respect what I'm saying and listen to what I'm saying and I don't care about the consequences? No, he got paranoid and he bought a big boat and he went and lived on it for like 10 years. And then after that he went and hid in the desert on a farm or something so that nobody could find him, mostly the IRS. But, he clearly didn't have the courage of his convictions to stand up and say, what I'm doing is right and what I'm teaching is right. And of course, Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of Mormonism, famously died because of all the people who were so angry with him storming the jail where he was being held for having destroyed the offices of a newspaper that had written nasty things about him. So he went and destroyed the office, burned it down. So he got caught and put in jail, and the townspeople took things into their own hands and they stormed the jail and they killed him. What did he do? He fought back. He killed a few people on his way out, right? Is this a person who's willing to die for his beliefs? No, this is a person who got caught in telling a lie, which he probably himself, well, I shouldn't say that because we don't know, but it's possible that he himself didn't really believe it deep down, and when push comes to shove, right, then they try and find a way out of the bad situation, rather than standing up for the faith that they're teaching. And that's not what the early Christians did. Some of them even went joyfully to their martyrdom. And just think about that. People went joyfully with the people who they know are going to torture and kill them, believing that they are doing a good thing. Who does that? Someone who genuinely believes in the thing that they are dying for. Martin Luther King's anniversary of his death was recently. It's this year, I think. It was a couple of months ago or something like that. And apparently, I was listening to an interesting broadcast about it, and apparently he had some premonitions that he was going to be killed. I think, the security people or the police or someone had told him that there was threats and things like that. And apparently, the last sermon that he preached, he gave this very impassioned speech about how willing he was to die in the name of the cause that he was fighting for. That's how passionately he believed in it. And he's kind of telling people, don't be sad if I die. And I'm not going to be sad because I know that I've done the right thing and I know that what I'm doing is worth dying for. And that's really touching because that level of belief is rare in our time. There are not that many people who believe in anything so strongly that they would be willing to die for it. But when we see that, it gives us a respect for their value and their passion and their commitment to what they're doing. Which makes a deception theory of the apostles of Christ really difficult to accept. Because this is not the behaviour of, willingly going to your death, being passionate about your cause and willing to die for it. That just does not fit the profile of someone who's come up with a story, concocted a story, and made it up about Jesus rising from the dead. And by the way, it also doesn't account for the appearances of the risen Christ, unless you want to say that part of the lie was not only that Jesus rose from the dead, but the other part of the lie is, and we saw him. But here you're going to have to deal with another problem, because we have lots of witnesses who said they saw him. So now, this is not one person making up a story. This is a lot of people making up the same story. And you know what we call that today? We call that a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories are not really respected very much. You can go on the internet and find heaps of conspiracy theories, but sensible people don't take them seriously, right? They tend to be considered to be fantasy. So to have this conspiracy theory that literally hundreds of people made up the same lie, and somehow, even though they all knew that they were deceiving the world, they all knew that it was a lie, but somehow they never leaked the fact that it was a lie and nobody ever caught them out on it and so on. Okay, come on, that's a conspiracy theory which is not really going to do the job for us. So another big red cross. Now, we move on to the mythology theories. These are interesting. So again, there's two versions of these. One is that there were lots of resurrection myths in the ancient world, and the resurrection of Christ is just one more resurrection myth, right? We've seen it in lots of other cultures. We don't take any of the other resurrection myths seriously. Why should we take the resurrection myth of Christ seriously? This has been a very popular one, which is why it's sort of low down in my list, although there's one more that's even more popular. When you actually look at the details, this one doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Number one, there are huge differences between ancient resurrection myths and even the apocryphal accounts of the resurrection of Jesus himself, right, the ones that didn't make it into the Bible. Put all of those in one basket, and then you have the accounts of Jesus' resurrection, which for many reasons is unique and in many ways not comparable to those other resurrection myths. Right, so what this argument is saying is that the story of the resurrection of Christ belongs to a particular genre. And what I'm suggesting is that it doesn't. It belongs to a very different genre. And you can tell that from all the details that we see. So let me give you some examples. One, the fine details, the very practical details that are involved. In other ancient myths, you just have like a story, because it's made up, right? It's something that people have made up. They don't go into details like, and then Jesus was fishing with the disciples and they didn't catch any fish, and he told them to catch, to throw the net, and they give you the number of fish that came up, and things like that. Or that he sat down and he ate roasted fish with them, right? These are really fine details. You don't get that in your normal genre of a myth. And they're very practical details that don't really add to the story, right? They're not really doing anything in making you believe the story more in the sense of, like, this detail fills in an important part. If you didn't have this detail, then the story wouldn't make sense, right? A lot of these details are just there because that's what people write when they're remembering something they saw, right? Oh, and by the way, I remember the car was red. Okay, it doesn't matter if the car was red or blue or whatever, the important thing is the car crashed or something like that. But when people tell you details like that, that's generally a sign that they're remembering something that they actually saw. Another thing that you don't find in any of the other accounts is that the witnesses are named. It tells you these are the people who saw Jesus who rose from the dead. That's not a feature of the genre of myths. And they even say, and you can go and ask them, okay, here are their names, go and talk to them. You don't find that in a myth. Many resurrection myths are not comparable, right? It's very easy to make this sweeping statement. You know, here are all these resurrection myths. Christ's resurrection just belongs with them. But in fact, there are some really serious differences. So one of the ones that are used are the Emperor Augustus. There's a myth about the resurrection of the Roman Emperor Augustus, who was in the 1st century BC. But when you actually go and look at what that myth was, it wasn't a bodily resurrection. It's not a dead man coming back to life. What here is called a resurrection myth is someone claimed to have seen his soul rising from the flames up to heaven. Right? That's clearly a very different thing to a man, a dead body in a tomb coming back to life. So they're not really comparable. And the few myths that are comparable all come from the time after Jesus. So the earliest one that is comparable, that has a dead person actually rising and coming back bodily to life, is the myth of Adonis, which is dated no earlier than 150 AD, more than 100 years after the time of Jesus. So this idea that the disciples just took a general myth idea that was going around in lots of cultures and they just put Jesus as the center of it, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. One myth that is definitely earlier than Jesus is the myth of Osiris, the Egyptian god. And I've heard people talk, by the way, about Horus, because there are some similarities between Horus and Jesus, like Horus was the son of a god and Jesus is the son of God and so on. But the myth of the resurrection in this case is not Horus rising from the dead, it's Osiris rising from the dead. It's his father. So let me just list for you a few of the reasons why this is a different story altogether. So 1, Osiris is the father, right? Horus is the son. Jesus is not a father. 2, Osiris is a political king of Egypt, right? He's a god who's the king of Egypt. Jesus is not the king of anything. Osiris is married. Jesus is not married. Osiris is murdered, right? So that someone can take his throne. Jesus is not murdered. He's tried and found guilty and then put to death. Osiris is killed by his brother who wants to take the throne. Jesus is killed by a whole community who are jealous of him. His wife resurrects him, right? So Osiris's wife is the one who gathers the pieces of Osiris's body that have been scattered all through Egypt. She goes around and looks for them and picks them up, brings them back together, says a spell, and suddenly he comes back to life. Of course, the Christians believe Jesus raised himself from the dead. The reason that Isis did that with her husband Osiris is because she wanted to have a son, Horus. So they say that Osiris had a son, posthumously, after he died, kind of thing. That was the point of him rising from the dead. Jesus didn't rise in order to have a wife and, have a child. And then Osiris, once he conceives Horus, he just disappears from the story, right? He's not important because the story is not really about Osiris. The story is one where Osiris is leading up to Horus. Horus is the interesting one in the story, although, much is made of Osiris in other ways. But Jesus is the one who's the center of the story. So there's lots of differences there. They're not the same story. It's not just like the disciples got this story from the Egyptians and then they made Jesus the center of it. That, once again, that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. So we're going to give this one a big red cross too. But there's another variety of mythology theories. And this is the one that says, okay, I call this the life of Brian theory, if you've seen the movie, right? So there's this good man who goes around doing nice things, right? But he's a perfectly normal human being. He doesn't do miracles. He maybe says things that are interesting and nice and those sort of things. And then every time, gullible people listen to him saying things, then they take what he says and they twist it and they embellish it and they build it up into something much bigger. And then after he's crucified on the cross, they remember a few things, odd things that he'd said, and they take it and they turn it into a big, story about him rising from the dead. And of course, if you've seen the life of Brian, it doesn't really account for the appearances of Christ after he rose from the dead, right? Okay, so if people come up with this story, it doesn't really account for it. But there are other problems with it as well. So we know that the accounts of the resurrection are very, very early in the story of Christianity, right? Generally, the kind of thing that this theory is proposing takes time to happen. So, for example, you need for the people who are actually there to kind of die, because that's how you can get away with a story that's not true. If you're telling a story in a community where people actually were there and the story is wrong, the people will tell you no, unless everybody is stupid. So really, I mean, one way to sort of agree with with this mythology theory is to just assume that everybody was stupid, right? Nobody was clever back then. They were all just gullible and silly and stupid. And I think that's a kind of chauvinism, to be honest. This idea that we modern people are so clever, and back then they didn't know anything. They couldn't tell fact from fiction because they were just so dumb. That's just patently false and very, I don't know. Anyway, I won't go further in that. Clearly, people knew how to think back then, right? We have the Greek philosophers, even before the time of Jesus, who run rings around a lot of modern philosophers. They were very clever people around at that time, and they knew the difference between fact and fiction in something that they'd lived through. We have primary sources, first-person witnesses, like St. Mark, like St. Paul, who actually saw the risen Christ. All of this was happening no more than 30 years after the actual events, when the witnesses were by and large still alive and still healthy. And then there's this idea of the tunnel period, which is really fascinating. So you remember we read a bit from 1 Corinthians 15, where St. Paul, we didn't read it, I quoted a bit from it, where St. Paul lists those 6 groups of people who saw Jesus. And Bible scholars are pretty convinced that what he was doing, he wasn't just like authoring that passage, but what he was doing was repeating a kind of a primitive Christian creed. It was a creed which, when they get together and they say, what do we believe? And then they have this kind of formula. This is what we believe. So I'll read it very quickly for you, because you can very easily see that it's in the form of a creed. Okay? He introduces it by saying, for I delivered to you first of all that which I also received. Right? So he says from the beginning, I didn't make this up, this is what I have been taught. And then look at the structure of it. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures, that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Right? So this is a creed. The structure of it is the structure of a creed. And then he goes back to himself and says, then last of all, he was seen also by me. He's kind of integrating his own experience into what he has received from others, right? Now, creeds take time before they gel and are formulated and are promulgated and spread within the community. So this idea of the tunnel period basically says, if St. Paul was writing down a creed in the 50s AD, then that 20-year period is when the creed would have been formed, and it would have taken time, some years, to grow and spread and come to be well known in the community. So that actually gives us evidence that they believed in the resurrection of Christ and the appearances of the risen Christ all the way back to just a few years, a handful of years after the events actually happened. Right? This is historical evidence that that was the case. And a really good, interesting sort of comparison to this is the appearances of St. Mary, which incidentally was 1968, which is also 50 years ago. I think, I'm not sure if I've got the order right, but I think either Martin Luther King was shot on one day and then St. Mary appeared the next day, or it was the other way around. I forget which. But if you're interested, you can Google them and find out. But they happened like within 2 days of each other, which is really interesting. Maybe St. Mary cares for the oppressed black people of America, who knows. Anyway, if you're interested in this apparition, which has a lot of similarities in that St. Mary appeared to many, many people on many different occasions, and here we are in 2018, and you can still go and find people who saw St. Mary with their own eyes. If you want to do that, you better do it quickly, because if they were like 20 at the time, and now it's 50 years later, like they're 70, they're not going to be with us forever, so you'd need to do it quickly. But we're 50 years down the track from the event. We have St. Paul writing here 20 years after the event and quoting a creed that goes back into that 20-year tunnel period. We don't know exactly how far, but certainly some years back into that tunnel period. So mythology theories are going to get a big red cross as well. For the second last of our theories, the hallucination or delusion theories. So here, this one says that the apostles were sincere, right? They weren't deceiving anyone, they weren't pretending or anything like that. But the problem is, what they thought they saw wasn't real. It was a hallucination, right? They thought they saw Jesus, but it was just a hallucination. You know, sometimes as part of a grief reaction when you lose someone that you love, I've had this happen to me, right? When my dad died many years ago, I remember on a couple of occasions like walking into a room and just having the feeling that he was in the room, or that he was going to walk into the room or something. And of course I'd immediately realise that that's not going to happen, and then I'd say, oh, well, you know, it would have been nice, but I know that that's not going to happen. So maybe that's what happened, right? The disciples loved Jesus, they missed him so much, they were grieving, and so they thought that they saw Jesus, but in fact they didn't. So this is going to suggest that the data that we have, those 3 pieces of data, are going to have to be attributed to basically malfunctions of the brain. The brain just didn't work the way that it was meant to. It wasn't reliable. Notice from the beginning, this might account for the appearances, and it might even account for the conviction of the disciples. If the hallucination was vivid enough, and if they were gullible enough, then they might have really genuinely believed he rose from the dead and been willing to die because he really and genuinely rose from the dead. But what does it not account for? The empty tomb. If I have this hallucination, there's a really easy way to work out whether it was real or not. Go and check the tomb. If there's a dead body in there, then it was a hallucination. It couldn't have been real. So this is a major problem with it. Another problem is that hallucinations and delusions are often symptoms of diseases, right? We said they're malfunctions of the brain, and they don't often happen in isolation. Rarely does a person just have a hallucination. Like, there's often other stuff going on. And we don't have any evidence for anything else being like psychiatrically wrong with any of the disciples. And also, what we're going to have to believe if we accept this theory is that it wasn't just one person, but in one case, 500 people happened to have the same hallucination at the same time. This is stretching the bounds of credibility, right? Can you really have exactly the same malfunction going on in the brains of 500 different people? That would seem really weird. When people hallucinate, they see different things, right? Different individuals, because what you see when you hallucinate depends not only on what's going on in your brain at the moment, but it depends on your memories. It depends on your experiences in the past. Okay, is it really sensible to think that 500 individuals with different backgrounds, different experiences, different histories would all have exactly the same hallucination? However, there are some rare cases where a specific hallucination or a delusion can occur. So let's just clarify, by the way, I've been using both words, but there is a distinction between them. A hallucination is where you have a sensory experience of something that isn't really there. So it's like you hear voices, but there's no voices. You see a pink elephant, but there's no pink elephant, right? So it's a sensory experience. What we would need for this to explain the appearances of Christ is it would have to be a mass hallucination, many witnesses having the same appearance, and as I've said, this is, that's just crazy, right? That's just fantasy to think that that could happen. But delusions are different. So a delusion is not a sensory thing, it's roughly a fixed false belief. So you believe in something, and it's really hard to shake you out of what you believed, but sadly the thing that you believe is false. And there are, in recent times, people have found problems with this definition of a delusion, but we'll just take the simple road for today. So an example of a delusion would be you're sitting and watching the news, right? You're seeing what's on the TV, you're hearing the words that are really coming out of the speaker, but in your mind you are convinced that the newsreader is talking about you, or you're convinced that they're sending a secret message to you, and you sit there and you think, oh, I've got to decipher this secret message, right? So that's a kind of a delusion, because as much as you might want them to be, the newsreader really isn't interested in you, and they probably don't even know that you exist, you personally, individually. Now, we do know that if a person has a strong delusion, other people can kind of be conscripted or dragged into their delusion, right? And kind of come to be convinced to some degree of the thing that they are mistakenly believing. Okay? A famous example of this, or not that famous actually, is called Folie à Dieu. I apologize for my French. In which a healthy person is very closely related or like emotionally tied to an unhealthy person, and the unhealthy person is having the delusion, and because of the closeness of that relationship, the healthy person comes to believe the delusion of the unhealthy person. Okay? Now, it's called Folie à Dieu for a reason. Those of you who are good at French will know that the Dieu means two. And there is this is very rare, there's an even rarer condition called Folie à trois, if that's the right way to pronounce it, which means three people. Because the clinical cases that have been documented have never been more than 2 or 3 people. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because to have the closeness of the relationship required for this to happen, people don't have that kind of close relationship with more than 2, 3, people at the most. So it does not account, this kind of thing cannot account for 11 disciples at the same time. Like if one of them was mentally ill and had this delusion that somehow they believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, it's not going to account for all 11 of them, much less for 500 people, many of whom probably don't even know the names of the other 450 people. Maybe they know 50 of the other group, but the other people in the group, but they don't know, all 500. So it doesn't fit the profile for this kind of delusion. Okay, what about mass hysteria, right? This is like large-scale delusion. I don't know, anti-vaxxers might be an example of that, right? Oh, vaccinations give you autism and they'll kill your children and so on. And then people write blogs about it and then, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then eventually you get like a large number of people who are convinced of something that's patently wrong. And by the way, I'm generally I hedge my bets and I'm very cautious in what I say, but please do not be an anti-vaxxer. That is really, really bad choice, because it's just wrong. Like the evidence is just incredibly wrong. But that's not our topic for today. Okay, could this have been what's going on with the resurrection? It's really interesting, right, this idea of mass hysteria, right, just people getting all excited about something. The fascinating thing is very, very few scholars, including scholars who, are skeptics, very few scholars have actually pursued this as a serious candidate. And there's got to be a reason for it. So here is a quote from Habermas's book, I think that is, I'm not sure. There are very few detailed accounts of this explanation. Of those who now prefer hallucination explanations, however, only a few scholars have pursued this approach in detail. while several other scholars simply mention the possibility or preference for the hallucination thesis. Right? Why is it not popular? Why is it not interesting to people? And there are lots of reasons to think that this would not have been the explanation for the resurrection appearances of Christ. One is, it is known that mass hysteria is less likely to occur among educated people, people who can think. Right? Educated doesn't necessarily mean I went to a modern university, right? It means people who are good at thinking about stuff. And we know that there were intelligent, thoughtful people among the disciples of Christ. We know that Saul and Mark and John were all very educated, right? John in the temple tradition, Saul in the Roman tradition. Mark had, Mark is actually his Roman name, right? So and he was reasonably well off. So there were fishermen who were uneducated and so on, but there were also some pretty bright sparks there. St. Paul, you only need to read his writings and the complexity of his thought and the grasp of language that he has to realize this guy is pretty bright. He's not stupid. He's not the kind of guy who reads about anti-vax stuff on the internet and, stops his kids from getting vaccinated. He's just not that kind of guy, right? And he's not the only one. Luke was a doctor, etc., etc., etc. It also doesn't fit well with the wide variety of personalities and circumstances and the environments in which the appearances occurred. Okay, maybe it happened once that someone thought and then they convinced a few people or whatever. But St. Paul lists at least 6 different times when it happened with different kinds of people each time. And that's only a representative of the appearances we think would have happened and are hinted at in the text. Okay, mass delusions, they're not like that. They depend on a lack of data. They depend on being able to get away with stuff. And when you have an appearance of a risen man happening over and over and over and over, that's just the wrong pattern. That's not how it works. And mass delusions rarely involve sensory experiences. Right? The anti-vaxxer isn't saying this is something that I can touch or see or hear or something like that. They're just saying, I'm making a causal connection between the vaccination of a child and them getting autism, right? I'm interpreting the data. What these appearances involved is things like, come and touch my wounds, right? Sensory experiences. Come and eat fish with me. See the oil dripping from my fingers. Right? Feel the heat of the fish as you hand it to me. These are sensory experiences. That's not how mass delusions work. Mass delusions are about ideas. They're about beliefs. They're not about sensory experiences. They tend to take a while to spread, okay? And they tend to sort of grow gradually. But what we have here is something weird. We have Jesus appearing for just 40 days, and then nobody after that says that he appears to them. If this was just people, hearing the story and then wanting to have their own story so they can fit in and join in, with what everybody else is saying, why doesn't it continue after the 40 days? Why doesn't it keep going? Why doesn't Jesus keep appearing for another 20 or 30 years? But he doesn't. He abruptly stops. And there's a reason given in the text, because he ascends into heaven. And after that, he appears once more, just to Saul. And that's the only appearance that happens after that. And finally, once again, I'll just repeat, although it might be a dodgy explanation, I think, for the conviction of the apostles and the appearances of Christ, it still does not explain the empty tomb, right? Even if everybody starts to believe Jesus is risen from the dead, it's so easy to debunk that, right? Look, that's his body. He has not risen from the dead. So we're going to give that a big red cross. So we only have one theory left, which you can guess is the one I think. Again, since we're using the Sherlock Holmes thing, when you have eliminated all of the theories that are improbable, whatever remains, no matter, what is it? Whenever you have eliminated all the, who knows this quote? No? Oh, come on. It's something like whenever you have eliminated all the other options, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the case. It's something like that. Anyway, I'm going to have to go back and reread that. Okay, so it seems to be the only theory that accounts, historically speaking, for all three pieces of evidence. And therefore, it's the most natural conclusion given the fact that we actually do have a lot of historical evidence about the resurrection. It only fails if you think that miracles can't happen. So this is the issue that I raised at the beginning, right? All of this historical investigation is all very good, but if miracles can't happen, then I'm sorry, you must be misinterpreting the evidence because miracles can't happen. So to finish off, let's just deal with this objection. Can we be certain that miracles can never happen? The only way you could be certain that miracles can never happen is to be able to observe every single event that ever happened from the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe and confirm that none of those events was a miracle. That's the only way you could be certain that miracles can never happen. Even the argument that says, well, I've never seen a miracle, doesn't really cut it. I've never seen an Eskimo. I genuinely haven't. I've seen actors who are dressed up in Eskimo clothes, but I have never seen an Eskimo. It would be crazy for me to say, because I have never seen an Eskimo, therefore Eskimos do not exist. It would be crazy for us to say, because none of us in the whole history of humanity have ever seen an alien, therefore aliens don't exist. Right? That would be crazy, because we haven't seen enough. So the argument from we've never seen, it makes you lean towards a conclusion, right? Because I've never seen it, I can lean towards the idea that I never will, and nobody ever will, but I could never, if I'm intellectually honest, I could never be certain about that. So that's the first point to make, and that's very important, right? Because remember, the argument here is the resurrection could never happen if we can be certain that miracles can never happen. If all I'm going to say is, I don't think that miracles can happen, then that's not really an objection to one miracle happening. And if miracles are by their nature unusual, if they are rare, then you should not expect to see lots of miracles. That would be weird if you saw lots of miracles, because that's not what they're like. So therefore, this is not actually a good objection to the idea that Christ rose from the dead, or not. Okay, there's more I wanted to say, but the time's running out, so I won't go into that. So if there is an alleged miracle, if someone says to you, a miracle happened, and can I tell you, as a parish priest, I have had lots of people over the years come up to me and say to me, Abuna, a miracle happened to me. And I apologise to any of you whom I have disappointed, but I am a skeptic at heart. And my first reaction is not, oh really, that's wonderful, let's go and sing a hymn, and praise God. My reaction usually is, tell me what happened, right? I want to hear the story. And I'm looking for the holes. And with one exception, they're very holy stories, with an E, not with a straight Y, right? Okay. I haven't been convinced of the stories. The one exception was something that I actually saw myself, which was actually in the house of some lovely Maronite people, which is interesting because they're just across the road. And I think it was actually in this area, and they had an icon of one of their saints, Saint Maroon, that was dripping oil. And this was before I was a priest. And we went and visited the house because people were coming to look and so on. First thing that made me think this could be something to this, nobody asked us for money. Right? There's no money involved. So that's a good sign. And then I went and I looked. And it was a picture, made of paper in a normal sort of picture frame, right? Just a skinny little wooden picture frame with oil dripping out of it, dripping down a kind of a cloth that was sort of attached to the bottom of it and into a bowl. And the bowl was full and the oil was dripping quite fast. And I made a point of hanging around for like a long time to see if this would continue or whether someone sneakily comes up and, replenishes the oil or something like that. And I made a point. It wasn't stuck to the wall. They had it on a table and the icon was at an angle. So you could actually see right behind the picture. And you could see the thin line where the frame meets the wall. So there's no pipes coming in through the wall or anything like that. You can see I'm a skeptic, right? And you could look under the table. There was nothing under the table. It was just a normal table with 4 legs and there's nothing under it. Feel under the table. There's nothing there. I did everything I could to try and debunk this alleged miracle. And I came up with nothing. So I still don't know what to make of that. It's a really weird experience. But should I say, because that's the only genuine miracle that I myself have experienced, should I say that, well, since I've never experienced another miracle, therefore I must not accept this as a miracle, even if I couldn't explain it, but I should still say, it has a natural explanation. Would that be the sensible thing to do? No, that actually shows a kind of prejudice. That actually shows a kind of closed-mindedness. That I'm actually not respecting the evidence that sits in front of me, the actual evidence that sits in front of me. And aletheia is truth, right? That's what we call these meetings. We're looking for the truth. So we need to respect the evidence that sits in front of us. So if the objection is, even though, historically speaking, like if this was a non-miraculous event, we wouldn't be having this meeting. Like I said, people don't argue anymore that there was a man called Jesus. But that's not miraculous. We know actually Jesus was a common name. There were lots of men called Jesus, and it's not odd, even if there weren't, that someone might come up with the name Jesus. Okay, nobody would question that if there is historical evidence for it. The reason the resurrection is questioned is, even though there's all this historical evidence that we've worked through, but it involves a miracle. And if that's your only reason for not believing in the resurrection, I don't think that that's a good and valid reason. I think that's a kind of a prejudice that that we need to overcome. We all have prejudices, and we all need to kind of overcome them. So, in summary, there's lots of well-established bits of historical evidence that account for our 3 main contentions: that the early Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead and were willing to die for it, that the tomb was empty, and that they believed they saw the risen Christ. And the only theory that accounts for all of those 3, or does so most fully and most appropriately, is the theory that Jesus actually did rise from the dead.